Let's start by taking 2 deep breaths. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. One more. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that was relaxing, especially with the ocean sounds in the background. Besides relaxing you tonight, you might be wondering, why am I asking you to take a deep breath or two? I want to connect you to the ocean. That's right. Right here in this very auditorium, you are connected to the ocean. In fact, anywhere you are on Earth, you're connected to the ocean. Scientists agree that there's oxygen from ocean plants in every single breath we take. In fact, 50 to 80% of our oxygen comes from ocean plants called phytoplankton. These small, tiny plants float across the ocean surface with the currents, and sometimes they're thick as 300 feet. In every drop of water, there are millions of phytoplankton cells. In the springtime, they increase in numbers because of the availability of more light and also nutrients. Just like with any plants, they photosynthesize. That means they capture the energy from the sun. Along with carbon dioxide, they make their food. And as a byproduct, they make oxygen. You might be wondering where that other percentage of oxygen comes from. The land plants, the rainforest. So thank you, phytoplankton, for making it possible for us to take every breath. We're also connected to the ocean through these amazing, beautiful sea gardens. These seaweeds not only make oxygen, but are in all the prepared food that we eat, such as ice cream, salad dressings, and they're also in our toothpaste. What I really like about seaweeds is that they contain all the minerals from the ocean, which is the same minerals that we find in our blood. Wow, that's a really human, strong connection to the ocean. Every moment, there are connections and interactions in coral reefs. These interactions are very complex. The coral, the fish, the plants, the invertebrates, they're all working hard to survive, to reproduce, to adapt to their environment, to find space, to find food. It's very similar to our life in our community. We're connecting, we're networking, we're depending on each other. We all have a place on Earth. These coral reef connections really come home to me when I'm diving. I think about the marvels of the continuous rhythm of life underwater. Each organism has a part, and they play it so well. I hope that you agree with me that the ocean is our lifeline to survival, and that with each breath we take, the ocean is what makes us who we are today. So, now that you're all zen with phytoplankton oxygen, I'd like to spend a little bit of time with you talking about what it means to be an ocean or marine scientist researcher that explores the estuaries all the way to the deep blue sea. And what drives that passion to discover? When we discover, we're looking for something unexpectedly, or maybe we find something in our search. We might become aware of maybe a fact or a situation. We may be the first one to observe a phenomenon that's happening. So, as researchers and as people, we have a curiosity. And that curiosity is what drives us to want to do research. It drives us to want to persevere, to be pioneers, to be risk takers, and also to explore and to discover. As researchers, we need to plan our research, and we start with a question, or sometimes it's called a hypothesis. You might wonder, where do we get this question from? Well, sometimes there's a very strong need. There might be a societal need. There might be a priority that the federal government or the state government is asking researchers to find out what's going on. Or there might be just an essence of wanting to know something. And that's where that question comes from. The next part of discovery or scientific pursuit is then to make your experimental design. And the experimental design is somewhat like a roadmap. And it helps you to understand how you're going to answer the question that you just put together. Then the next part is observations. This is really the fun part. It's the part where you can go into the lab and you go into the field and you start to make those observations, collect that data, follow that roadmap. And you might have experiments set up with lots of replications and controls and variables. And then when you're done with the experiment, you end up with your results. Now your results need to be analyzed. Your data gets analyzed. Then hopefully it's presented, like at the Ocean Science Lecture Series. There's a publication. We share it. We share those results. And hopefully it answered the question. If it didn't answer the question, there might be more questions that come out of it, and you start the process again. So results are very important because that's really the deliverables of the scientific pursuit. And if we don't do that, then all that information will be lost forever. So to bring this home to you, I'm going to take you on a journey. I'm going to take you to a fairly remote place, and I'm going to tell you about a project that I helped to lead back in 2007 to 2009 with a very talented team of people who worked with me. This place where we're going is an island called South Caicos. It's in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and the Turks and Caicos are British overseas territory. This is South Caicos. You can see it's a very low-lying, very arid island. They sometimes call it the Big South, although it's only 8 square miles and has about 1,500 to 2,000 people. The Turks and Caicos is also a place where there's lots of fishing that goes on. It's a community, and sometimes it's known as the fishing capital of the Turks and Caicos Islands. So you might be sitting here thinking, well, where is this Turks and Caicos? It's this group of islands here. It's an archipelago just below the Bahamas. If you've been to the Bahamas, it's very similar to the Bahamas, just above Haiti and Dominican Republic, and about 600 miles from Miami. And for your history buffs out there, in 1492, Christopher Columbus came to the New World, and he landed in the New World in a place called Grand Turk. So here we are, flying into South Caicos to this really beautiful airport. Actually, this is the airport terminal right here. And this is the fire department. So we landed in South Caicos. They had to, well, I won't tell you that yet. So here we go. Welcome to South Caicos. Welcome to South Caicos, where the horses run wild through the streets. They're wild horses. Where there's a donkey on every corner. Where there's boats named Vodka and Sprite. where there's beautiful flamingos in the salinas, where there's still windmills standing that were used for 300 years to help make salt that was traded with Bermuda, where all the water comes from rain, so rain catchments are used, where the dogs in the islands are called pot cakes, and the grocery stores are indeed very quaint. And if you want to go out to a restaurant, you need to bring your own food for the cook. Dominoes are a great pastime. And there's so much character in the islands. And the southeast trade winds blow and make sailing just great. And the sunsets are beautiful. And you never get tired of the turquoise waters. So the Turks and Caicos aren't really foreign to me. I spent 10 years in the Turks and Caicos in the 1980s. And so I got to know the place very well while I was starting a conch farm. I was one of the co-founders of the conch farm on Providenciales. So I got to know the islands very well. I got to know the fisheries department and the officers. I got to know the ministers. And so when we wanted to start this project that I'm about to tell you about, they were able to help get all our research permits that we needed. And so the ministers and the fisheries officers were very pleased to have us there. So here we go. We're going to ask that question. We're on our scientific pursuit here. The question is, where are the lobster puruli? You might be wondering, what's a puruli? It's a baby lobster, and you can actually see one right here. I'm going to talk more about this. So we were in the Turks and Caicos looking for lobster puruli for two reasons. We wanted to understand where they were coming from to help the fisheries, because it is a fishing community and they want to know where their lobsters are coming from. And also we were exploring the opportunity of possibly doing an aquaculture venture. That would be farming lobsters. So before we got started, we needed to know what is the life cycle of the lobsters. Now this is the spiny lobster, right? The spiny lobster, not the clawed lobster, but the spiny Lagusta lobster. And they spawn in the spring and the summer. The females carry about 250,000 to 1 million eggs on their belly here. And the eggs hatch 3 to 5 weeks later. You can see the little eyes of the lobster developing here. They hatch in deep oceanic water because that's where you find the adults. And the larvae that hatch out of those eggs are called phylosoma. And they hatch out and they drift for 12 months. It's a very long time, very complex life cycle. And way less than 1% survive in the wild. These puruli are almost the size of your hand. They're very thin, very fragile. And they use their little appendages here to search for food. Then they metamorphose after this very long 12 months floating in the sea into what's called the puruli that we were just talking about, or the post-larvae. And they're quite small. You can see they're about the size of a penny. They settle in the shallow waters on the new moon. They come in and they look for places in the mangroves, in the seagrass, in the seaweeds, in the sponge habitat. And then after they've settled, they grow into juveniles, which then migrate off to the deep reefs. And these juveniles eat on mollusks, little clams and crabs, shrimp, fish. And they mature to the eating size that we're used to knowing in about 1 to 2 years. So I talked with you about this team, this talented team that we had in the Turks and Caicos. And we have Julie and Brian. And we have Jeff Beezer, who works here at Harbor Branch. And then we had a crew that was from South Caicos that worked on the project with us. And us expats, which is what we're known when you're not a Turks Islander, us expats lived in apartments on South Caicos. We had 2 apartments in this apartment building where Jeff Beezer and his wife lived, and Julie and Brian lived in an apartment. And then we had the upstairs of this orange complex, which was our office. And so when I would go down to the Turks and Caicos every 2 or 3 months, I would spend time living there and working with the team there. We got to know the fishermen really well, and the fishermen were the ones that helped to tell us where the lobster environments are, where the currents are, where all the different places on the island we should go visit. And so we would often have these meetings so that we could help to understand where should we go looking for these puruli. So once we had all of this information, then we moved into the design phase, the experimental design phase to answer our question. And so here we have South Caicos, and the green dots there are our sites. There were 16 sites. And we were looking for places that had that were shallow, that had sandbars next to it. We looked for areas where the currents were moving quickly. We looked for all different types of habitats. We were on an exploratory mission to find where these lobsters could be coming in. Well, then we needed to find a place to build what we call collectors. And so we needed a site that we could assemble these collectors, and we found this old abandoned hangar. It wasn't being used for planes anymore. It was being used to hold hay bales that were, did I tell you there were wild horses on the island? Well, there were wild cows and the donkeys, and so they'd put the hay bales out so that they could attract the animals in. And then it was used as a workshop to work on cars. So we asked, could we borrow this hangar for a period of time to build collectors? So then we transformed this hangar into a production area to be able to build collectors. And I want to mention something about these collectors, and I'm glad that Jerry Kersott is here today because he helped on the lobster project, especially when we started in the Keys and also in Puerto Rico, and we were looking for new ways to collect lobsters. So thank you, Jerry, for that. So these collectors are made out of polypropylene, and all of the rope is taken apart, and you'll see what happens. We had 12 people working from the community on these collectors. And we built 1,500 of them in 4 months. We put the collectors out in the ocean. It was summertime in 2008. And we only put a few out because we wanted to make sure that they were working. And maybe a map like this and a tracking like this is familiar to you. 2008 was like 2004 here in Florida. So many hurricanes. Well, in 2008, September, you can see Tropical Storm Hannah. She went through the Turks and Caicos and dumped an amazing amount of rain. And you saw how arid and dry the islands are. So they filled a lot with water, and there was a lot of areas that you couldn't drive through. The airport, they couldn't fly all the way into that terminal I showed you. You had to park the plane way down at the end of the runway and then get a truck to bring you in. So when it rains there, it's really quite devastating. Well, so Hannah went through on September 2nd, 2008, and there was a couple other tropical depressions and disturbances behind her. Well, this is what was behind her. That tropical depression turned into this hurricane known as Hurricane Ike. There hadn't been a major hurricane in the Turks and Caicos for 50 years. Hurricane Donna was the last big hurricane that moved through there. So this hurricane, when it came through, was very unexpected. We didn't think that we would be in the line because really the hurricanes were going below the Turks and Caicos or way above the Turks and Caicos. Well, this hurricane I is sitting right over South Caicos. It was a Category 4. It gusts of winds to 160, and it sustained winds at around 135. This is a picture from the space station. I was in here in Florida, and our crew was down south, and I was certain that our project was over after this. There was so much devastation. I know the buildings aren't built very strong in the Turks and Caicos, but there was about 80% damage of all the buildings, and 65% of the roofs were no longer there. So this was definitely a very, very devastating hurricane. So the crew on the ground in Turks and Caicos and South Caicos called and said, please come to our rescue. So I brought some generators and supplies, and when I got to Providenciales, I said to a friend of mine, will you please fly me over to South Caicos? Because they have no electricity, they have no water, the supplies are limited. And as it turned out, it was 6 weeks before power came back on. But you know, that community was so resilient, just like we were during our hurricane, came together as a community. They had lots of aid, they had lots of good food. And we came back together as a team, and we kept training and working with our island partners, our island workers, and we continued the project. And all of our collectors were built and ready to go into those 16 sites. And then you might say the other shoe fell. In August 2009, the ministers who I knew for many years were taken over by the British governors in Britain. And you know, it is a British overseas territory. And so after some investigation, Britain had found out that there was corruption taking place in the Turks and Caicos, that the overseas developers and investors were bribing the ministers to buy crown and protected land. And so this investigation went on for 3 years, and in 2012, the minister system came back into power. But meanwhile, I'm beginning to wonder whether or not, once again, the project was going to keep going. So now with the ministers not available to speak with, I needed to get to know the governor. The governor was a very nice man, and he invited me over to Grand Turk, which is the capital of the Turks and Caicos. And so I went to visit him at Waterloo. That's the name of the governor's house at Waterloo, which was built in 1815. And as all good British people, Peter, he invited me in for a cup of tea. And so we had a chat about the project, and he was very excited for the project to continue. So we put more collectors in the water, and we used the local fishermen and their fishing boats to help us go to all the different sites. They were our workforce there too. And each collector that we removed to look for the lobsters, now remember, the lobsters come in on the new moon. And so we would go and find our collectors 5 days after the new moon, after the lobsters had already migrated onto the collectors. Bring the collectors up, shake the collectors, and then we would begin our observations. We would begin to look to find where these lobsters were. And if you look very carefully, you can see a few of these baby puruli, baby lobsters, sorting through all the different materials that were shaken off the collector. Oh, yeah, look at this. This is a clear puruli. Can you see it here? You can see the little eyes. It's very tiny. This is actually in centimeters, so it's about a half an inch, like the penny that we had seen earlier. When they first settle, they're very clear, and then within about 24 hours, they start to pigment, and then they pigment a little bit more until they're ready to molt. And this is what a newly molted lobster looks like, and one that's had a second molt, and one that's had maybe a third or fourth molt that might be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks old. Now, we weren't keeping these lobsters because we were just trying to figure out where they were coming from. So we would collect all the lobsters and put them on these little pinwheels, and then we would transfer them into the mangroves, which is where you find small baby lobsters living. And so we would put them in here, and they could carry on with the rest of their life. So we were doing pretty good in those 16 sites up in South Caicos area here. But we really weren't finding exactly where most of the lobsters were coming in. So we traveled down to this little island chain here called Big Ambergris and Little Ambergris Key. And you can see the Turks and Caicos is on a bank. The bank is about 60 miles by 60 miles. And it sits on a bank, and then you've got this major drop-off area. And you can see it in this picture here. Now, this major drop-off, I'm talking 7,000 feet deep. That kind of drop-off at the edge of the bank of the island. And then the shallows are shallow. I mean, everything from sandbars, maybe up to 12 feet. So we decided to put out an array of collectors. And we put out somewhere around 200 or 300 collectors out there. So this is our new experimental design, as you would call it, down in Little Ambergris, Big Ambergris area. And this time we decided to put the collectors on a long line. And so you can see them all in a row there. You can see them underwater very clearly. And then at Harbor Branch, we built what we call a mechanized vessel. And this was designed by our engineers here at Harbor Branch and built here. And getting it down to the Turks and Caicos and back again is another story that I'll save for another day. And some of our engineers that were part of this, we had Lad Bourne and Jeff Beezer, we had Ben Metzger, we had our machinists and our fabricators working on it, Jimmy Nelson. We had a whole crew because nobody had ever built this mechanized vessel before. So let me show you how it works. Here you've got the long line, and the mechanized pulley system brings up the collectors. Once the collector gets in the mechanized system of the vessel, it clamps it down, and then it shakes it up and down. And then you can see all the debris and all the little lobsters get collected in a basin below that. And then it goes off the end of the boat, and the next one comes on. So it was a very effective tool for collecting lobsters. Recorded all the data, kept track of which collector had what animals on it. So what did we discover? Here's the results. We discovered oodles and oodles of puruli. I know oodles and oodles probably isn't a very good scientific term. There were thousands and thousands of lobsters. So many, and they're all coming down into this area of Ambergris Key. So if we go back and look at the Turks and Caicos, right here, sitting on this bank, and if you look out here, you can see deep water. So if you think about a lobster traveling along for 12 months with the currents, it comes along and it gets swept up by the southeasterly currents and winds and pushed up onto shore. And Ambergris sits right here. So what was happening is all these baby lobsters were coming up at the edge of the bank. This was an amazing discovery, to know where all the lobsters were coming from into the Turks and Caicos. And you can look here again at the deep water. You can see that the trade winds are pushing the waters and pushing the lobsters. So it was a successful project. We did find where the puruli were coming from. And so at the end of the day, at the end of 3 years, we were very rewarded, but at the same time, very challenged by all the things that happened along the way. And one thing, as scientists, we know we do meet the unexpected. We know we do need to be flexible. And we know that we'll never find everything in a textbook about what's going to happen. And that's part of the excitement about discovery and being an ocean scientist or a marine scientist. Here at Harbor Branch, all of our researchers do this every day in the estuaries, in the coastal waters, in the deep sea. And as Dennis said, we want you to come back and visit and learn more about the discoveries that we make here at Harbor Branch. And I'm going to show you a very short video that's brand new that talks about some of the other work that we do here at Harbor Branch. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge all those that helped on the lobster project over the course of the project time that we were in the Turks and Caicos. And I also want to give some credit to those that helped with the beginning video. Brian Cousin and I put the video together, and then there was footage that was also shot by these various groups. The Harbor Branch video that you're about to see was put together by a communication team, and then the paintings that you saw throughout the presentation were done by my husband, Gary Hodgkins. So I'm going to show you the video, and then after that I'm going to come back and answer any questions that you might have.
Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute is a research community of marine scientists, engineers, educators, and students focused on ocean science for a better world. From its earliest days, Harbor Branch was fueled by the drive to overcome the technical challenges of ocean research. The quest to develop innovative technology remains a driving force behind Harbor Branch's research themes of ocean exploration, understanding marine ecosystem function, and wise use of marine resources. Ocean exploration is the foundation upon which FAU Harbor Branch was built and continues to be at the forefront of Harbor Branch's research efforts. Today, the ocean engineering and technology research programs continue to advance ocean exploration by creating new technology, developing laser imaging and other sensors, as well as robotic vehicles that can operate independently at sea for months at a time. Researchers are using this technology to explore and study the nation's ocean frontiers and educate the next generation of ocean scientists. Understanding how marine ecosystems function is another of Harbor Branch's top 3 research themes. Programs in this area seek to explore the relationships between human activities and change in estuary and ocean systems. Scientists and students are studying coral reefs to determine the impacts of environmental stressors and diseases on these fragile and important species. A variety of work is being conducted in coastal systems, including the Indian River Lagoon, through studies of harmful algal blooms, seagrasses, and water quality. Scientists and students in the Marine Mammal Research Program study population health and behavioral ecology from the tropics to the Arctic to understand the effects of toxins and pathogens on dolphins and whales, how they search for their food, and how they adapt to their ever-changing environment. Scientists are also conducting ocean dynamics and modeling research to find out ways that currents, tides, and other modes of water movement affect marine ecosystems and planetary processes. The Wise Use of Marine Resources theme seeks to explore and nurture the benefits that humans derive from the oceans, while honoring the need to do so responsibly. The Marine Biomedical and Biotechnology Research Program works to find medicines from the sea. By researching marine natural products derived from things like sea sponges, scientists and students have discovered compounds that fight human diseases like cancer, malaria, and tuberculosis. FAU Harbor Branch's aquaculture and stock enhancement program is a leader in researching sustainable fish farming methods. The goal is to transfer that technology to the private sector, ensuring that there is a safe, environmentally friendly, ample source of seafood to meet the world's demands. It also seeks to replenish what has been depleted in our oceans and to ensure a competent workforce to drive the industry forward. For more than 40 years, Harbor Branch has remained a leader in ocean science, driving innovation in ocean engineering, at-sea operations, drug discovery and biotechnology from the oceans, coastal ecology and conservation, aquaculture, ocean observing systems, and marine education. Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute at Florida Atlantic University. Ocean science for a better world.